In our previous message together, we had begun to look at the characteristics of heavenly wisdom. And so today, with James's help, I want us to continue looking at these characteristics or marks of godly wisdom. Now, just as a quick review, the first mark of heavenly wisdom, which we looked at last time, is found back in verse 17, and it's the word pure, where James writes, "But the wisdom from above is first pure." Now, this is the mark of wisdom which has to come first in our lives, if you'll remember. And the word pure refers to moral integrity and holy living in our lives. It's the opposite of the world's wisdom. And you'll recall that in the previous verse, verse 16, the world's wisdom is described as confusion and corruption. In fact, verse 16 puts it like this: disorder and every evil thing. And those words can literally be translated as confusion and corruption. But you see, heavenly wisdom, God's wisdom, godly wisdom, is just the opposite. It's first and foremost morally pure or clean. And you'll remember that this word refers to someone who backs away, who repels away from sinful pollution of any kind. They prevent sinful behavior from taking over their life. You see, to the person who's maturing and developing godly wisdom in their life, sin becomes more and more polluted and repulsive to them. Why? Because they're growing deeper roots spiritually, and they are becoming more pure in their relationship with the Lord. So James puts this word pure first, and that's because every adjective or description of heavenly wisdom that he's going to give us, which follows in this list, is literally hinged to or connected to this first word, pure. You see, if we get purity wrong, then we're not even on the path, the right path, to finding or much less demonstrating godly wisdom in our lives. You see, this is the very first guideline to use when we're determining what's wise and what isn't wise for us to do. Is it pure? Is it clean? And is it right for me to do or partake of as a believer or as a Christian? Well, today we pick up with the second mark or characteristic of heavenly wisdom. And James goes on in verse 17 to add the word peaceable. You could literally translate this characteristic or mark of wisdom as peace-loving. Now, please understand that this isn't the kind of peace-loving person who literally sets aside truth just for the sake of keeping the peace. In other words, this peace-loving, wise person doesn't compromise with sin in order to keep the peace at any cost. That's not the kind of peace we're talking about that will do anything, even if it's wrong, to keep the peace. In fact, Jesus Christ said that his truth would not bring peace, but a sword. That is, the gospel would bring turmoil and trouble between children and parents, among relatives, and even extended family. And he says that in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. And a believer, a Christian, may very well stir things up, and they may very well experience trouble instead of peace in their life. You know, in fact, there's one Greek scholar who wrote, this word peaceable refers to a person who may be standing up against sin, but while doing so, they hunger for peace. yearning to heal all divisions by wise counsel. You see, as believers, we must be marked by a peace-loving attitude towards other people, whether it be in our own family, the church family, or with our fellow employees, or even in the community. Because as Christians, it's absolutely essential that we be characterized as people who don't stir up dissension and don't stir up strife, but people who seek to have peaceable relationships with those around us and with those whom we come into contact with. And you know, this is especially true in the church. You know, I think one of the saddest things to see is a congregation that is literally ripped apart by division and infighting. And it literally ends up destroying the body of believers because they choose demonic wisdom, earthly wisdom over heavenly wisdom. And even Christian families have suffered separation and division because of infighting and dissension, which has created irreparable harm and devastated relationships between them. And it's so sad, isn't it? But unfortunately, it happens more than we care to admit. You see, it's so vital that we seek peace in our relationships with one another, because the world is watching us as Christians. Well, James adds yet a third word to the list of 7 characteristics or marks of heavenly wisdom. And it's in verse 17, and it's the word gentle. Gentle. Now, this is a different word, by the way, than the one he used earlier in verse 13, where James referred to a wise person's gentleness. You see, back in verse 13, James used a word that's synonymous with meekness or humility. But here, the word gentle in verse 17 refers to someone who continues to trust God in the face of injustice. In fact, the Greek philosopher Plato used this word to refer to someone who responds wisely to the loss of personal rights and interests. And you could paraphrase this word gentle as one who willingly yields their right of way to another. And I would imagine we see this word in action even after church services, because we may yield the right of way to another person who's backing out as we are pulling out and getting ready to leave the parking lot. Now, for example, this word is also demonstrated biblically or scripturally in the yielding of Abraham to his nephew Lot in Genesis chapter 13. And so I'd like to take a minute just to read to you verses 1 through 12 of Genesis 13. I just want you to get the context of the story and how it unfolds. So Abram, his name was Abram at this time. God had not yet changed it to Abraham. So it says, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot, who was his nephew, went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. God had blessed him. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, and he also had been blessed and had accumulated much because of his association with Abraham. But the land, and here's the clincher, but the land could not support them. In other words, it couldn't support both of them with all their livestock. While they stayed together, it says, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered. It was fertile. And it was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot moved and lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Let me summarize. Essentially, Abraham said to Lot, listen, we've got way too many people, way too many herds and flocks for us both to try and live off the same land in the same area. Our possessions and our herds are just way too big, way too great for us to successfully do this, Lot. So he says, guess what? He says, Lot, I'm going to let you choose. You can have the fertile and the well-watered Jordan area, or you can have the land of Canaan. Now, I'm kind of putting this in our modern vernacular here. Lot probably thought to himself and said to Abraham, are you serious? You're going to let me choose? I mean, you've got to be kidding me, right, Uncle Abraham? I mean, you really are going to take the best, right? And leave me to the land of Canaan? You're going to take the fertile Jordan area? And Abraham says, no. He says, you choose. You're my nephew. I love you. I'm going to give you the opportunity to make what you feel is the best choice for you. And so Lot prayed about it for all of about 15 seconds. And then he said to his uncle Abraham, sure, you know what, I prayed about it. I think I'm going to take the Jordan Valley. All that fertile Jordan Valley, that's where I'm going, Uncle Abraham. And so Abraham let him. Abraham said, you take it. It's yours. You can have it. And I'll take the land of Canaan. Now, to be honest, we would have probably expected Abraham to say something to Lot like, Lot, listen, you're my nephew, and I've been thinking it over after I said that to you a few minutes ago. I'm older, and God gave me the actual covenant promise to build a great nation out of me and not you. So because I'm special in God's eyes, I've decided to exercise my rights. And guess what? I'm going to take the Jordan Valley. That's mine now, and you can have the land of Canaan. That's what we probably would have expected Abraham to do. But instead, Abraham yielded. He stepped aside and he allowed Lot to have all the fertile land. And why could Abraham do this? Because I think he ultimately believed in and entrusted his life and his family to God's watchful care. Now, he had a lot of faith lessons yet to learn, but I believe he was in process. I believe he knew and he was convinced, at least to some degree, that no matter what the circumstances, that God could and would care and provide for him and his family, his herdsmen, his flocks, all of his possessions. You know, even the Apostle Paul, when facing maltreatment and unjust treatment, he was able to endure it. Why? Why could Paul handle all that? Because, like Abraham, his faith was in the Lord, and he was fully confident that no matter how unfair his circumstances, God would see him through and provide for his needs. I want you to listen to what Paul says in the book of Philippians chapter 4, very familiar verses, but we need to be reminded of them, verses 11 through 13. Paul says, "Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things, not some things, a few things, important things. I can do all things through him," meaning Christ, "who gives me strength," or who strengthens me. Now, I think that says it all, don't you? I think that says it all. It's because of their faith and their trust and their belief in God that they were gentle in spirit, and they were willing to trust God and to yield to others. There's nothing more that I can add to that. Well, James goes on to give us a fourth characteristic or mark of a person who's growing in wisdom. He says in verse 17 that wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and then now fourth, reasonable. Now, this word reasonable refers to someone who is easy to work with. He or she is open to reason. They're not defensive or angry when you disagree with them, but they're agreeable. And in the time in which James lived, this word was actually used in a military context for someone obeying orders without question. That's literally how it was used. It was also used to refer to a child submitting to the will of their parents. So this is someone who's open to reason. They're not defensive or angry. When you disagree with them, they're agreeable. And they obey or do what they're told without question because of that. You see, the opposite of being reasonable is being stubborn and resistant to the will of those in authority over you, and ultimately to the will of our Heavenly Father. You know, another way of saying it is that the opposite of being reasonable is being bullheaded, or as we said, stubborn. And for those of us who go off to work this coming week, we're going to have opportunities to demonstrate which one we are as we respond to those in authority over us on the job. Now, let me say that it's easy to spot a wise person in this regard. And what do I mean by that? For example, they're easy to work with. They're open to correction. And they're not in the back room with others running down their boss or their fellow employees. They're not the ones griping about the foreman or the shift leader. They're not the ones sloughing off on the job or doing the least amount possible just to get by and collect a paycheck. And that's exactly what this word reasonable means. It means that you're agreeable and the kind of person that others can get along with. You do what you're asked and you do it with a great attitude. It's a sign of wisdom. It's a mark of someone who's growing in wisdom, that they're not selfish or stubborn. They're not headstrong. They're reasonable. They're a reasonable person. And they get along. And they do what they're supposed to do with a great attitude. They're part of the team. And they care about others. Well, this is where I'm going to stop for today. And next week we'll continue again to look at how James describes heavenly wisdom as we uncover more of these characteristics or marks of godly wisdom. I told you that there are a total of 7 characteristics or marks. So far we have looked at 4. And next week we will conclude this topic as we look at the final 3 characteristics or marks of what heavenly or godly wisdom is all about.